Good afternoon. And now you're being recorded, if that's okay with everybody. A lovely warm afternoon welcome to you all, and it seems like some of you are actually sitting in some warm sunshine or getting some rays from the sun this afternoon, which is obviously lovely. And it's a real delight. I'm Mark Arira-Gaya. I'm the part-time director at the European Network on Religion and Belief, and I've been sort of in post for 2 or 3 months now. And you've got Tej here, Tej Mala, who has been working with the organisation for a little bit longer. We've also got an intern called Sarah, who can't sadly be with us today, but she's doing some really good work with partners. We're doing a project called Get the Trolls Out, which is looking at hate crimes across Europe, and some other work to do with diverse communities and people from all sorts of backgrounds that are working within Europe in non-religious contexts as well as religious contexts. So it's so nice to see so many of you from across Europe today and further afield. I think Farid is in America at the moment, obviously with his work. So it's really good to see you today. And to mark of course, the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. That's why we've focused on today, Tuesday the 15th of March, as the day to have this discussion. I'd really be great if we've got in the chat here, if you could say who you are, where you are in the world, and maybe what your organisation, if you work for an organisation, involved in an organisation, tell us something about that organisation, about the work that you're doing. Please use that chat, because we will collect all of that up, as well as this recording, and we will be writing up some action notes from this and making the recording available to others. So we're hoping for plenty of time for discussion, for you to give us your views and thoughts on these important matters after we've heard from our 3 presenters, which we're delighted to welcome along today. We've got Linda and Stephen and Farid, who have kindly agreed to be with us today. So who are we? I just want to say a few words about who we are, the European Network on Religion and Belief. We're an anti-discrimination network covering the religion and belief strand of the EU fundamental rights and equalities policy. So that's kind of how we've emerged, and we came to be just over 10 years ago. As I say, we've got a small team, we've got a small office, which we haven't really been using very much over the previous period of time because obviously of COVID. And we have a board, a magnificent board. Hopefully some of them will be in the meeting today, 10 members of our board, including Abdullah Falik, who was really keen to have this discussion around Islamophobia today. But sadly he's unwell, which is obviously a great shame. So the network was formed in response to the increase in discrimination and hate crimes on religion and belief grounds across Europe. We're keen to build a European network for mutual understanding, collaboration, and common action between religious and non-religious groups. ANOR, but that's our shortened name, which I think you can see on the back here, aims to work collaboratively and in partnership with faith and belief and anti-racist based civil society organisations and their leaders to combat community harms, racial and religious discrimination, hate crimes, and to promote stronger, safer, and more resilient community responses, and to strengthen mutual understanding and harmony in the field of religion and belief. As we move out of the pandemic, ANOR aims to strengthen and further develop its European interfaith dialogue, anti-discrimination network, and grow collaboration projects with other anti-discrimination and anti-racist organisations. And this is our second online interfaith dialogue event. We had one earlier in February looking at the infodemic and the relating to COVID and the faith and community, faith and non-faith responses to that. And we have others planned on a range of different issues. We're very keen to work with you and with others on the multiple issues facing Europe And we've worked closely in partnership with the Cordoba Foundation on this occasion. And as I said, with our board member, Abdul Farid. And I just want to read what Abdul has sent from his sort of sick bed. I think it's only fair to do that. So poorly today, I'm so sad for him. Islamophobia, and this is what he wanted me to read to you. Islamophobia is no longer something on the margins. It is real and affects lives of many Muslims in Europe and beyond. Islamophobia is not something abstract, as some pundits like to point out. It is real, and it leads to physical attacks on individuals. It leads to the tarnishing of the image and standing of Muslim communities. It leads to our institutions being attacked. Moreover, as we have noticed of late, Islamophobia is being institutionalized in various political parties in Europe, and it is becoming structural in law and policy. This is why this event is entitled as the endemic of Islamophobia in Europe. We know too well what hate leads to. It has led to genocide of Bosnians in Srebrenica. Look at what is happening in Ukraine now. Our prayers and solidarity are with the brave people of Ukraine. So a strong message there, I think, from Abdullah. So the idea of today as an inaugural sort of webinar on the international day to combat Islamophobia is to see how we can play our role with you to facilitate dialogue around the pressing issues of political violence and structural discrimination affecting vulnerable religious and non-religious communities alike. As Abdullah has just said, and I'm sure that you're going to be saying as well, there are rising concerns among civil society organisations about the contemporary development of Islamophobia and resulting anti-Muslim hatred in Europe. And we thought that it was really important to come together today, especially in light of the two recent reports, and we've said they're monumental reports, because I think they are really on this topic. Obviously, there's 2020 European Islamophobia report, the 6th consecutive edition, which has been co-edited by Farid, which examines Islamophobia in 31 European countries, documenting in 886 pages the worsening of Islamophobia. And it says in that report that Islamophobia and its increase has reached a tipping point. Secondly, today we're going to look at the report, The Dinner Table Prejudice, Islamophobia in Contemporary Britain, which has been co-authored by Dr. Stephen Jones, who's from Birmingham University. And we're also delighted to be joined by Linda Hyokki. I hope I've said that right. She'll probably put me right. Oh no, I've said it totally wrong. She'll put me right. I meant to say that in the when I was having a chat with you earlier. How did I say your surname properly? But she's currently completing a PhD on Finnish Muslim converts' experience of Islamophobia. So without any more ado, the running order is slightly altered from your agenda, and we're going to start with hearing from Stephen, and then Linda, and then Farid on their work, their reports, and their thoughts on these issues. So warm welcome to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's a pleasure to be here. I'm just sort of scanning down the chat to see where everyone's coming from, and it's quite amazing to be talking to such a broad audience. I'm coming myself from a place called Northwich, which is a small town in Cheshire. So a few people who are not too far geographically from where I am right now, which is where I live, a few miles north of Birmingham. So I'm going to be talking through a report I authored with Amy Ainsworth, which was released in January in the UK. And those who are joining us from the UK might have seen some of the coverage it got. I'll cover some of that. It was quite widely covered in the UK press, which was nice to see, most of it quite positive as well. It doesn't have anything like the scale or scope of the European Islamophobia report that Mark mentioned at the start. But I think it does do some useful things. Particularly talking about the differences in the way that Islamophobia can be conceptualized as either a racial or a religious phenomenon or both, and and the way in which Islamophobia can be normalized. I think that's one of the things that I'm particularly interested in, is does Islamophobia seem not to have the same kind of level of pushback in the public sphere that other forms of prejudice have, however bad they may be in society. There's at least some kind of public sort of social norm that it's unacceptable to state certain things, which doesn't always seem to apply to Islamophobia. So I'm going to talk a bit about that topic as well. Okay, so I've got a few slides and I've got a few charts, and I hope they won't be too dry and dull. But I'll start by just saying a little bit about the UK context, which might be helpful to sort of frame what we did for this survey. So in the United Kingdom, we have a pretty, it's far from perfect, but a reasonable scheme of what is known as equality strands, where different kind of aspects of people's existence are protected in law, and religion's one of those. Religion was a very late addition, but there remains very vigorous debates about what exactly protecting religion involves in practice. And one of the ways that's been manifest in British society is sometimes quite furious debates about how to define racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism and Islamophobia especially have been quite vigorously debated. In the case of Islamophobia, the debate circulates around whether Islamophobia can be characterized or not as a form of racism. And there was a report, now quite influential, fortunately, report by a group called the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims, which is like a coalition of cross-party members of parliament that come together to try and influence policy and politics. And their definition was attempting, I think the specific wording was that they defined Islamophobia as racism directed at Muslimness or perceived Muslimness, which draws, I think, from the work of Salman Saeed and others. So there's been a real attempt in the last 5 years or so, that's not the only definition that's done that, to try and cement a definition of Islamophobia as something that's aligned with other forms of racism. And so what this report was trying to do was, in a sense, kind of pick up on and intervene in these debates by by conducting a poll that tried to ask questions about different kinds of ethnic group in British society and also test prejudice against religion specifically. And I want to try and pull out some of the themes I was talking about by going through that data. So I'll go into a quick slideshow and I'll try and get through it as quickly, well, not as quickly as I can, but fairly promptly at least. So I hope you can all see that. I've been having some PowerPoint problems, so I'm hoping they will not occur. So we seem to be all right so far. So essentially what this survey does, so it's a survey by the company YouGov of 1,667 people. And what we tried to do is entirely our survey to design the questions as we wanted. And we tried to use various different items to test prejudice towards different groups within society, ethnic or religious groups. We asked questions about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia very specifically, and particularly kind of conspiratorial thinking about Muslims and Jews in British society. And then we asked questions designed to test prejudice against religious beliefs specifically, not about sort of communities of people. I'm going to work through those in turn, as it were, as fast as I can. It will give you a bit of a survey of what public perceptions in the UK are like. We don't have any European comparative stuff, unfortunately, although, you know, if someone wants to give me money to do that, that would be something that I'll be very interested in. So I'm going to start with talking a bit about the anti-group prejudice measures we involved, and this gives the quickest sort of overview of what different groups are perceived as being in UK society. So we tested this for a range of different groups, so Christians, Jewish people, Muslims, Sikhs, white British people, Black African and Black Caribbean people, Pakistanis. Of course, we have a very large Pakistani community in the United Kingdom. And the terminology is a bit, we had to meddle with this a little bit, but what are generally regarded or described in the UK as being Gypsy, Roma and Irish traveller communities. We sort of condensed that to Gypsy or Irish travellers because when we were testing the items, some of the phrases weren't really recognised by the people being surveyed, which is not ideal, but one has to make decisions as you are making surveys up. And you can see from the red slide on the right there that you can see, and I've circled the two biggest ones, are the percentage of our survey sample that held negative views of these different groups. And you can see we have two standout groups, the Gypsy and Irish traveller communities, were the sort of the least liked, as it were. That's how the phrase that's sometimes used in and sociology in the United States for these kind of measures. And then after that, Muslims. So 44.6% negative views of Gypsy and Irish travellers, 25.9% of Muslims. Now, one thing to say about this is that that doesn't necessarily correspond to rates of discrimination against particular groups of people. One of the things you can see, and I'll try and use my cursor to highlight it, is that Black African and Black Caribbean people, they came up with 6.4% of the survey sample, suggesting they felt negative about that particular community, which is actually a lower percentage than white British people, which is quite a striking finding. But of course, we can show quite clearly by looking at statistics on discrimination, stop and search by police statistics, statistics about educational progression and attainment, that Black African, Black Caribbean communities suffer some of the worst rates of discrimination in Britain. So the way I see these two bars, the higher bars there, are not so much rates of hostility and discrimination, but rather the extent to which there is an absence of public social sanction against for prejudice towards particular groups. So that would be the extent to which people don't just feel uneasy about or hostile towards particular groups of people, but are happy to acknowledge that in surveys. So that's the sort of one of the headline stats we went with. We've got the prejudice questions here, and there are too many for me to go through, but just to kind of give a bit of an indication, we had a question that was, there are areas of Britain that operate under Sharia law and where non-Muslims are not able to enter, and 26.5% of the UK public agreed with that. And then another one there I've circled in purple, Jews have disproportionate influence over business and finance, and 12.6% of people in the survey agreed with that. So that they were designed to sort of measure the extent of conspiratorial thinking. And I'll come back to some of those measures. The first question, I should say, I don't know how these things play out in public discourse in other European countries, but the United Kingdom, we do have some sort of informal legal councils, Sharia councils, but those have the public representation of those has been such that there's been something of a conspiracy developed over a period of probably the last 10, 15 years, that there are certain areas of the UK which are governed by Sharia law informally, which is a hopeless exaggeration, of course. It even appeared on Fox News a few years back with some very wise Fox News commentator in the United States suggesting you couldn't enter Birmingham if you were not a Muslim, which was very amusing to me as someone who commutes to Birmingham from Cheshire pretty much every day. So that was fun. So anyway, so let's talk a little bit about the different groups. This is the thing I want us to really flag up as we move through different groups and where prejudice was concentrated. I'm going to have to skim through this pretty quickly, and I'll try and use these little blue things to highlight the different contrasts we've got here. As you might expect, if you know survey methodology in UK society at all, there are fairly persistent groups that are quite common, sort of overrepresented when you measure prejudice and intolerance. So I've got the Sharia law question I spoke about a moment ago and sort of cross-tabulated that, as it were, between different groups and put this in the bar graph here. And we can see that, I'll try and skim down quickly. I don't really have the time to do justice to it, but we find prejudice much more concentrated amongst older people than younger. You can see the vast difference in agreement there. There's not so much class difference here, but that's one I'll come back to. It seems to suggest that Church of England affiliates are more prejudiced towards Muslims than non-religious people, but actually that's just an effect of age. In the United Kingdom, as in many European countries, we have a process of secularization ongoing, and younger people tend to be non-religious. So when we controlled for different factors, that effect actually disappears. So ignore that one. But we do find that prejudice is more concentrated among men and Leave voters in the European Union referendum. And then the most pronounced difference, I think, is between Conservative and Labour voters, the two main parties in the UK. Something like 43.4% of Conservative voters indicated they agreed that there were Sharia law no-go zones, compared to 14.7% of Labour voters. And indeed, the third party in the UK, the Liberal Democrats, was similar. The other parties were too small to measure. So then we went and to talk about anti-religious prejudice. So we were thinking, how can we measure prejudice against religion? And we asked a few questions about people's dislike of religion. And one thing you should note about the United Kingdom, just as a sort of aside, is we really don't like religion at all, it turns out. So we asked a question here, for example, looking around the world, religions bring more conflict than peace. And some 71.4% of people compared to 8.3% agree with that statement. And it's pretty much across the board, very high levels of dislike of and hostility towards religion, which isn't, of course, the same as saying people are prejudiced. But we did follow that up with an open response question where we asked people to say, thinking around about the different religions around the world, do you think any religion has a more negative impact on society than others? And so this was an open response. Not everyone responded. Some 30% of the survey sample did respond. Of those who did respond, 64% suggested it was Islam and Muslims. So that gives you an indication of what people are thinking about when they're thinking about whether religion is bad or a good thing. So that's something, that orange slice of the pie chart there is about 20% of the overall survey sample, which is quite a high percentage, but bearing in mind that this was an entirely open response, you put your own answer in type question. The one that I want to focus on though is this question, which is something we designed to try and test prejudice towards religious belief. And what we said was, for each of the following religions, please say whether you think the religion teaches its followers that its sacred text should be taken literally, word for word, or symbolically, understanding its poetic meaning and historical context. Now, that's a bit of an odd question in many ways. There is many different responses you could give, which would be entirely reasonable. I'm not sure you can give a clear answer in the case of most religious traditions, and we can't really expect people to necessarily know the answer. I mean, we asked this question for Islam and the Quran, Sikhism and the Guru Granth Sahib, Christianity and the Bible, and Judaism and the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. And of course, I teach religious studies. I wouldn't necessarily be able to answer the question for all those 4 religions myself. But what we wanted to test is the extent to which people feel it is correct to respond in any sense with the response totally literally. Because if you think that any of those 4 religions is taught in a way that is fundamentally or inherently literalistic, that I think can be taken as a measure of prejudice, albeit a kind of soft prejudice towards a religious tradition. And you can see from this red, the red line there, that the responses for Islam and the Quran were considerably higher, nearly 3 times higher than all the other religions. Some 21.1% suggesting that Islam is a kind of totally literalistic religion. Now, the interesting thing, and this is where I come back to the question of sort of how Islamophobia is normalized and where race and religion fits in, and I'll sort of close on this, is that when we compare that religion question with the other measures where we were looking at different forms of negativity towards ethnic groups and different forms of racist or racialized attitudes. So I have another question that we asked here where we looked at people's views about Pakistani communities in the UK. Now, Pakistani communities in the UK are overwhelmingly Muslim themselves. They're one of the more impoverished communities in the United Kingdom, and historically one of the groups that has suffered most from racist abuse. And so I've divided it up, and you can see there's a fairly consistent pattern with the groups that the levels of negativity and where those found. Again, so the older people are more negative than younger people. We have men more negative than women, Leave voters more negative than Remain voters, and Conservatives more negative than Labour. We can also see here very marginally, and I've circled it here, that there's a slight tendency for those who are in this group, technically known as the C2DE group, which is a way of measuring professional occupation in the United Kingdom, and I think other countries too, where C2D basically stands in for working class professional occupations, so manual occupations, as opposed to ABC1, which is sort of higher professional occupations. And you can see here that the working class groups are marginally more negative. This is non-significant, but there was a significant relationship even after controlling for other variables for some of the other measures we used. When we asked questions about, do you think certain groups of people should be banned from coming to the UK, for example, that was one example where we found a significant effect. And the interesting thing is that then when we looked at the religion question, the sort of the class effect flipped round. So what we found was that when we asked this question about Islam and its scripture, the Quran, and then sort of cross-tabulate that, we have a higher percentage of people saying totally literally amongst the ABC1 groups than we do amongst the working class groups. And that again this is just a descriptive chart we have here, but it's even after controlling for all the other factors. So controlling for age, controlling for political affiliation. This is a sort of a direct kind of class effect, as it were. And that in essence is where I want to end with the data. But the question that I really want us to flag up by way of closing is just to say that, why is this the case? And I think there are sort of two possible outcomes. One is that you can see that from this grey, the grey here is the people who don't know. And in this case, the ABC1, the upper middle class folks, seem to be more confident in making a judgment. They're less likely to say that they don't know what the response is. It's almost like because they're presumably more educated, they're more confident in making a judgment. But because Islam and its nature is somewhat miseducated in the United Kingdom, the people who are more educated are more miseducated almost. That's one possible reason. The other thing I'm sort of considering, and this is not just considering as a hunch because I've done some qualitative research which suggests the same kind of thing, but I think there's something about how, when it comes to Islamophobia, there are discursive switches between the language of race and religion that allows it to be normalized. And we can see, so in some of the interviews I did in the project that led up to this one, that those of a fairly liberal disposition from middle-class backgrounds will be very uncomfortable making comments about ethnic groups specifically, but will nevertheless be slightly more comfortable making sometimes very broad generalizations about religious belief. And it's almost like the religion aspect allows Islamophobia to sort of percolate into the middle classes, into the sort of acceptable areas of society that other forms of prejudice are not allowed to go to. And that's where the title comes from, actually, the dinner table prejudice, which is a phrase that was coined by a Muslim, then MP, I think, now a member of the House of Lords, Rana Sayyid Varsi, who suggested that Islamophobia has, in a sense, passed the dinner table test. It's allowed in spaces where it wouldn't be in others. So I'll close it there because I've spoken for too long already, but I hope you found that useful and we can pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you very, very much, Stephen, for that really concise summary of your report and the key findings there. It's really, really great. So we'll come back at the end of this session to take questions, but people could mull that over and even begin to put them in the chat. That would be super. We'll go to Linda now. Linda, sorry, I got your surname. I pronounced it wrong, so you're going to pronounce it right for me.
It's absolutely fine. Don't worry about it. Most probably, I wouldn't even be able to pronounce your surname by the first try. So, yeah. So it's Hyokki.
Oh, okay.
Yes, exactly.
No, I was way off. But look, thank you, Linda. And you're a writer and commentator on Islamophobia and racism. And I was saying earlier, you're currently completing a Ph.D. on Finnish converts. Experience of Islamophobia, and I know that you've got some interesting thoughts about and insights into research around Islamophobia, and so over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. So indeed, mainly these comments that I'm about to give here as my contribution, they are connected to my PhD research, and sort of I'm going to be talking about this a little bit about the debate that Stephen also previously mentioned in terms of why we should consider Islamophobia as racism. And at the same time, I think that Stephen's contribution was very much, it was nicely illustrating the way how Islamophobia can be researched from a prejudice studies approach. And I think that I have more of a, let's say, post-colonial, decolonial approach, maybe. So it's completely different. So I hope that everybody will also benefit and enjoy these comments. All right. So in that sense, I would like to, start. Basically, what I have been looking into in my PhD thesis are the convert Muslims' experiences on Islamophobia. Actually, I started my thesis by using the term Islamophobia more or less, but then slowly throughout the years, I have actually turned into using more anti-Muslim racism. And in Finland, the scholarship on race and racism is, it has actually in the last 2 decades mainly focused on the ethnic minorities of the Sami people, Roma, as well as anti-Black racism, Russophobia, and xenophobia towards immigrants from Muslim majority countries in general. And my own research has, however, as it's an empirical research, it has shown that, and this is not new to the Finnish context as such, but generally speaking on converts, that converts from European countries, from the West, actually everywhere, as well as in Finland, they are racialized as being part of a racial religious group. So they are categorized in the same way as Muslims of color are categorized as the other in the society. And they are attributed these similar characteristics that are used to depict them as inferior in opposition to their non-Muslim fellow citizens. For example, maybe some of you know about the shooter of the Christchurch massacre. He, for instance, expressed in his manifesto a very blunt hate towards convert Muslims, and he even defined them as race traitors because of the fact that he sees that once a person converts to the religion of Islam, that this person is basically not anymore, shouldn't be considered as a white person, or as a white person basically. So even though it is common to embed studies and policy works within the framework of immigration and integration when we're talking about Muslims in European societies and in Finland, of course, I think that attempting to apply this immigration framework to the study of convert Muslims who are socially, politically, and economically very different from the migrant Muslim community, especially if it's a newer community. So I think that kind of an approach is very irresponsible because the social status of convert Muslims, it requires this attention, in my opinion, when we are analyzing the status of different Muslim communities in the Finnish society in relation to whiteness, as well as the privileges that they have with their access to certain spaces, to certain services, and the privileges that they are denied because of the racialization process, especially when their otherness is visible. So I think that in that sense, I would just like to say that I think that we are long overdue for getting that integration framework in research and discussing about Muslims. I mean, of course, we can talk about this argument of mine also in the context of newer Muslim communities with migratory background. But of course, here I'm especially wanting to put focus on the convert Muslims situation. So employing racialization as a process and as a concept, maybe a conceptual tool, and understanding then Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism while looking at these convert experiences provides, I think, a space where conversation about race can move beyond the black-white paradigm, the very traditional black-white paradigm, and to discuss what kind of new racisms minorities in Finland also experience. So practically in terms of racial categories, racialization of Muslims, it means that when Muslimness, in quotation marks, or Muslim traits are essentialized as inferior, barbaric, violent, backward, patriarchal, or whatever, these are also mostly associated with cultural traits assigned to Arabs. And then Finnish convert Muslim bodies are rejected from the category of whiteness or Finnishness, regardless of their ancestry as such. So when we use racialization as a conceptual tool or theoretical tool, maybe in analyzing these experiences in Finland and elsewhere in Europe as well, we're able to pinpoint the porous boundaries of Finnishness and whiteness, I think. So as such, also the salience of religion as a marker that determines whiteness is revisable, I think. This can be translated also in the Finnish context. If we're looking into the way how the Tatar Muslims in Finland experience living as a Muslim in the country, or how they are portrayed in media reports, in contrast how immigrant Muslims or Muslims of color are portrayed. So Tatars, just for those who don't know, very shortly, Tatars, they are a Muslim community in Finland and a couple of other Northern European countries. They have lived in Finland since the 19th century, a very small, culturally very well-established community, phenotypically white, actually. Even though the question is not actually it's not of a different religious identity per se. What we have here are two communities. We have the convert community, and then we have the Tatar community, with very different historical, social, and political contexts. Yet both they could phenotypically be classified as white. However, I think it's safe to argue that for the convert community, the experience of being racialized as non-white relates to their practice and manifesting of religious identity very visibly. And this factor is actually missing in the accounts about the Tatar community and let's say claims for assimilation, from which then follow that a higher level of assimilation and invisibleness of one's Muslim identity, I think, grants the past as white and as a Finnish person. Yet the argument begs for more research, I think, that should be done with the Tatar community. And I unfortunately don't have the resources at the moment in terms of my own PhD thesis, but I am very much looking forward to further opportunities in that sense, because I would like to see how actually, so far I have only looked into the media portrayals of the Tatar community and how the magazines, newspapers report about them, how they are basically coded in the media language. But I would like to very much look into the question how the Tatar community themselves regard whiteness or Finnishness and such. So at the end of the day, I think that when we are researching convert Muslims in Finland and their experiences on anti-Muslim racism, this must be situated in the larger context of histories of Muslims and other minorities in the country, and for the following reasons. So firstly, the experiences of converts, they don't occur in a vacuum, of course. So they reflect the historical continuities of otherization and racial hierarchies in Finland, to which minorities have been subjugated. And secondly, it would be, for instance, be wrong to start the inquiry of how Muslims and Islam are today and have been in the past perceived in Finland from the gradual arrival of the newer ethnic communities in the 90s in Finland. So approaching the experiences of convert Muslims by linking the general presence of Islam in Finland to immigration, as has been largely done since the past 20 years or so, it would be false in my honest opinion, since the convert experience must be considered by using concepts such as Finnishness and race from a totally another perspective. And finally, even though experiences on anti-Muslim racism, they can overlap, I mean, the experiences of converts, they can overlap, of course, with those of, for instance, the newer Muslim community who are of maybe Somali descent, of an Arab descent or Turkish descent, what, you know, you name it. We have here race, whiteness, and otherness as concepts, and they get very new dimensions from the perspective of converts. And this is because the converts, they have to go through a different kind of a negotiation process, because they have to negotiate their and others' ideas of Finnishness, of belonging, and the identity as such. So if you would be looking, for example, at the history of the Tatar community, you would see that there is no one Muslim experience in Finland as such. So you always have to kind of consider them separately, however, all together in kind of like a part and parcel of a bigger issue of an endemic otherization, of an endemic racism, so to say. So yeah, and I hope that this can inspire some discussion today. hopefully, in the question and answer session. And yeah, let's see what kind of comments that the audience has on my arguments.
Thank you very, very much, Linda. Yeah, some real food for thought there, and coming at it from some different dimensions. That's really super. I'm sure there'll be lots of comments and questions when we get to that session in about 10-15 minutes time. Our last speaker is Farid, Dr. Farid Hafez, who's in the United States of America, across the Atlantic, but he's joined us today. Thank you very much for being with us, Farid. You're visiting professor of international studies at Williams College, a non-resident senior researcher at Georgetown University Bridge Initiative at the School of Foreign Service, and you're founder and co-author of the European Islamic Report. And this, the most recent one is 2020. I think that's your sixth. And actually, when I was looking back at the big report, I noticed that you've had more than 120 publications in leading journals recently, such as Politics and Religion, Patterns of Prejudice, and German Politics and Society, amongst so much else. So you're a very busy man. So we're delighted to have you here with Stephen and Linda and all the people that are in the room to hear you. So thank you very much, Farid.
All right. Thank you, first of all, for having me here and for doing this great job of such an interesting panel with great to see also Linda again, and to first time meet Stephen and you who set up this panel today. So basically what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the findings of our last report that you just mentioned, which did not deal with 2021, unfortunately, because we're still a little bit lacking behind, but should be out soon also, but rather with the year of 2020. So just like to start with, the European Islamophobia report is very much a larger collaborative effort. And I'm also happy to see actually James Carr, who is authoring the report on Ireland and has been doing so since 2015, and also Nada Dosti, who has authored the report on Albania, in the audience. So I'm sure they can also contribute afterwards to our discussion from their research that they have been doing for the last couple of years. Like Anna Spiracli, the co-editor, the other co-editor alongside myself, I was very happy that we were able to continue with this project. It has been the 6th edition that we have published. And basically what we do with this report is we try to understand what is going on between January 1st and December 31st within a year. And trying also to see what are the tendencies within those different countries that we are observing, and the 40 authors are observing in those 30 countries that we're looking at. So for the year 2020, I think one of the most interesting aspects, and what I will also do, because you can download the report for free, I just shared the link in the chat menu. So you can all of you can download it and have a look at specific countries if you're interested to do so. So as you can see with our report of 2020, since this was the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, many people would have suggested that the pandemic would be the main theme of this year. And the reason why we did not take the virus on the cover, but we rather put a person on the cover, has to do with what we were observing within 2020. Obviously, the pandemic, and Europe was a center of the pandemic, as it was said by the World Health Organization. It forced the retreat of everyday life to the intimate private sphere. So what we could see is also a shift from the physical manifestation of anti-Muslim hate crime, very much decreasing in numbers in some areas, but still a shift also to social media when it came to hate crime data, as it was collected throughout Europe. On the other side, we could also see some countries where anti-Muslim hate crime did not decrease at all. One of the interesting cases was Germany, for instance, where the official institutions of the police were documenting 901 Islamophobic hate crimes that were committed across the country. 146 of them targeting mosques and 48 targeting people. So still there is a wide discrepancy between the documented numbers of anti-Muslim hate crime and the real numbers. We know, and I can just hint to this report that was done by the Fundamental Rights Agency, which was arguing that only about 12% of the whole population of Muslims is even reporting hate crimes that they have been witnessing. So we can assume that the real number is much, much higher. Although what we can also see within the last few years, that there seems to be a growing consciousness on behalf of Muslims to also report hate crime that they are witnessing. At the very same time, you see a lot of discrepancy between the countries. Like, for instance, in Germany, police authorities have documented overall nearly 32,000 cases of hate crimes, including nearly 1,000 anti-Muslim hate crimes. France has only recorded a total of 1,140 total cases of hate crimes, including 235 anti-Muslim hate crimes. So rather than suggesting that hate crimes against Muslims happen more often in Germany rather than in France, I am very much inclined to question how seriously the French police authorities just document hate crimes in general and anti-Muslim hate crimes in specific. Also, one of the things that we could observe that going back to Germany, anti-Muslim social movements such as Pegida organized their rallies despite of the pandemic throughout the year of 2020. And again, the example of Germany shows that the pandemic had no effect on hate crime statistics or even far-right street mobilization. And rather the opposite, many far-right politicians, like back then chairman and presidential candidate of the far-right in Austria, for instance, used the pandemic even for underscoring his commitment to fighting Islam, when during one of his rallies, he said, quote unquote, "Corona is not dangerous, the Quran is much more dangerous," unquote. So these are just it's just one of many examples that I could give that we have been seeing throughout 2020 of how the far right related to the pandemic in mobilizing against Muslims. So the reason, going back to my initial introduction, why we did not choose the pandemic, but rather a person that manifests in a way institutionalized Islamophobia by state actors, and why we put the French Prime Minister at the cover of our report, was because what we could see is an attack on Muslims, which does not only represent like Islamophobia in a stricter sense of attacks on Muslims and the questioning of Muslim presence in Europe, but even more broadly, an attack on civil liberties, and specifically an attack on Muslim civil society actors. So the cover showed the French Prime Minister, Macron, who together with the Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, has severely cracked down on the Muslim civil society and also on anti-racist activists. The French intelligence agencies proclaimed in 2020 to undertake mass surveillance of a large part of the French Muslim population in what Amnesty International heavily criticized in terms of the so-called counterterrorism measures, as they were called by the French government, as quote unquote, violating the principles of non-discrimination, non-refoulement, and the right to freedom of association, unquote. And this is also what our authors for the French report, Shafika Atalay and Dahina Moussi, have revealed in their report on France, when they said that the state has engaged in a veritable witch hunt and has raided and shut down dozens of Muslim establishments and associations considered a national threat, or, as the government called it, quote unquote, an enemy of the Republic. And they continue arguing that nevertheless, Darmanin, the interior minister, has also publicly admitted that many of the raids that were conducted by the security services were even only a way to send a message, or in other words, combating the so-called war on terror by terrorizing and stigmatizing a whole group. And there is actually a report that has just recently appeared by a UK-based institution, Cage, which did a more detailed report on what French Muslims are going through or have gone through in the last 2 years, also focusing on some of the things that we have problematized in our European Islamophobia report for 2020. One aspect of this institutionalized Islamophobia was also the so-called law against separatism, which is a way of institutionalizing Islamophobia and implementing authoritarian policies. In the name of fighting what the French government calls Islamist separatism, Macron's government has legitimized a crackdown on Muslim civil society organizations. And again, according to Macron and his government, it was Islamist separatism that is protected by what has been coined Islamo-leftism, itself emanating from what they call alien social science theories entirely imported from the United States. And that has also enhanced a general attack on academic freedom and freedom of speech, especially by rallying against post-colonial or anti-colonial discourse. And all of this was legitimized basically after the murder of French history teacher Samuel Paty. We had 56 mosques that were suspected of separatism, hundreds of mosques since then that have been raided systematically, and one humanitarian and one anti-racist organization, which was, I think, one of the most well-known in France, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, that were also closed and that had to flee, CCIF resettled now to Brussels in Belgium. So, although the reasons for closing them were later revoked, which was like connecting them to the murder of Samuel Paty, the outlawing of these institutions was upheld by France's highest administrative court, the Council of State. And also, along that, several mosques and schools have been closed since. The critics of separatism bill rightfully fear that it will lay the ground to dissolve future Islamic organizations. And the bill had been enacted upon in 2021. And there is not only the fear of the dissolvement of Islamic organizations, but also that there are no legal proceedings or a due process that could protect those organizations by being such a politicized event. Beyond France, and this is not only France that we have been problematizing, we see similar authoritarian shifts also within other European countries, such as Austria, where I originally come from, and the country that I have left since. Also there, after this militant attack on the 2nd of November in 2020, there was a huge raid that also hit Muslim civil society organizations, as well as critics of Austria's authoritarian anti-Muslim policies. And again, in 2021, we see just a continuation of these politics. Austria implemented a law that outlawed what they call political Islam, what is basically what the idea of France is in terms of Islamist separatism, or which a notion that we know from the German authorities, what they call legalistic Islamism. So by trying to framing the problem not as Islam, and actually Macron and back then Sebastian Kurz arguing that we want to protect the vast majority of peaceful Muslims, and framing the problem as being political Islam, Islamist separatism, or legalistic Islamism, what they are doing is trying, with that kind of method, defending themselves against any kind of allegation that they would curtail human rights, especially religious freedom, and presenting themselves as being tough on a political phenomena, but really respecting human rights, including religion, the freedom of religion. Especially when we look at the raid that happened in Austria, which hit more than 70 people and institutions, and was even then expanded to include more people, that went hand in hand with the freezing of bank accounts, of assets by these people, originally claiming that these people would topple down the Egyptian regime, destroy Israel, and create a worldwide caliphate. All of these reasons are not related to any kind of domestic activity, but rather to foreign policy, which also was the reason why some observers articulated that there might be much more foreign policy pressure of why to do that. But at the end of the day, they did it, and there are also domestic reasons to that. I would argue that weighed also much stronger than the foreign policy reasons. One of the interesting aspects with which I also want to conclude is that there is a heavy investment also of different foreign lobbies that are feeding into that kind of discourse. And I think we cannot only, we can see how people like Macron and Kurz related to other authoritarian regimes like Egypt, for instance, but also how other anti-Muslim think tanks and people like Lorenzo Vidino, who have contributed to this kind of witch hunt and McCarthyism idea of how to approach Muslim institutions within the West, have gained their moment. Lorenzo Vidino himself, not only as an author of many Islamophobic reports, but also he himself was an official witness in this Operation Luxor that hit so many people in Austria. So for the Austrian case, very different to the French case, the higher court of Graz has ruled that the raid was unlawful, and also the investigations against the former president have been dropped. The former president of the Islamic Religious Society, who was also a suspect of terrorism. But still, the investigation is going on against nearly 100 people with still bank accounts and assets of most of them being frozen up until today. One of the things that we have been also witnessing is that some of these countries have institutionalized pioneering institutions for the institutionalization of Islamophobia, like the Documentation Center for Political Islam in Austria. And we see a growing cooperation also between those countries. And all of this happens at the backdrop where, like a most recent report by the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is the pioneering European Union agency protecting fundamental freedoms, has just issued a report warning that discriminatory impact of counterterrorism measures on specific groups, particularly on Muslims, are very problematic. And also Amnesty International has clearly warned against the expansion of the so-called war on terror. But this is what we are seeing in countries like France and Austria, but also other countries like, for instance, Denmark, and some local governments who are trying to copy-paste what they are seeing in those two countries. While institutionalized Islamophobia has the outcome of a hegemonic, or is the outcome of a hegemonic discourse, and is shared across several political camps in power, not only on the far right, but very much on the centrist right, and even in some cases on the centrist left, the independence of the justice system is still sometimes helpful to defend the basic liberties, such as freedom of religion, belief, or freedom of speech. And this is, I think, one of the main tools that can be used in order to counteract that. But it obviously needs much, much more, because at the moment where people like in office, like France or Austria, try to export also their experience with Muslims and their framing of the Muslims as a political problem, this becomes much more problematic throughout the European Union. And there is, what we can witness, a strong interest on behalf of these countries to export these measures. So I will end with that, and looking forward to have an interesting discussion with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Linda. And thank you very much, Steve and Farid. Thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you everybody else for coming along and being part of the dialogue and the thinking and the discussion here.